Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Amir. And actually, when Amir first contacted me about this, I really had to think about what approach I would take. So I'm actually going to manage expectations to the start, because I'm not actually going to talk an awful lot about, if you like, Irish people over here over the centuries. I decided I wanted to start with what I think will be a very familiar history for a lot of the people in the audience, given your interests. Because of Stoke Newington's long history as what has been described as being one of England's most important centres of religious, political, cultural and social dissent, a quote I've borrowed from Rab McWilliams in his excellent book. So dissent in that context encompassing both religious dissent, as in the original dissenters of the various Protestant traditions who refused to conform with the practices of the established Anglican Church of England, and hence were known as nonconformists, and of course also the intellectual dissent associated with authors like Mary Wollstonecraft and Daniel Defoe. So, I'm going to cover 5 examples very quickly in under 25 minutes, and they're going to relate to some key moments during what is popularly referred to in Irish history as the 800 years of English rule, roughly delineated from the 12th century, when the Anglo-Normans arrived, through to 1922, when we had the independence of Ireland and also the partition of Ireland that you still see today. So, for chronological context, and because I'm going to go through things very quickly, I'd like to ask you to try and fix a couple of periods in your mind. So firstly, the mid-17th century period, the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the following conquest of Ireland by the Parliamentarian Army. Then we have the early 17th century period of the reign of the devoutly Anglican Queen Anne. We then move on to the late 18th century, by which time power in Ireland was very firmly concentrated in the hands of a Protestant Anglo-Irish elite. And then lastly, we will conclude with the late 19th century. Around that time, British politics were embroiled in the topic of Home Rule for Ireland, but opposition to Home Rule in Ireland was very, very strong in Ulster, the northernmost province of Ireland, and that in itself was a legacy of the fact that all the way back in 1609, James I had directed that the province should be planted, should be colonised, with loyal English-speaking, English and Scottish Protestant settlers, and displacing the rebellious native Catholic Irish. So here is the first of our places. Fleetwood Street, off Stoke Newington Church Street, named for Fleetwood House, which used to occupy the site of the fire station. I've borrowed one of Amir's images to show this for you. So this house was originally built in the 1630s by one Edward Hartop. He later raised a regiment for the Parliamentarian Army in the English Civil War. But following his death, his widow, Dame Mary Hartop, then married another general in the Parliamentarian Army, one Charles Fleetwood. Now, although Fleetwood did hold many senior roles in the period known as the interregnum between the execution of Charles I and the restoration of the monarchy, he wasn't directly involved. He didn't actually sign the death warrant for Charles I, so he basically managed to survive and live on for a more or less peaceful retirement in Stoke Newington. But here you can see him on the right in his soldiering days in the 1640s. And what you also see on the screen is what I think is a really fabulous example of his signature. And that is actually on, it's very, very dramatic. So that's actually on a letter that's in the National Library of Ireland. And the reason it's there is that by 1652, Charles Fleetwood was a very significant person in the history of Ireland. In that year, he became the Lord Deputy of Ireland. And at the same time, coincidentally or not, he also married Bridget Cromwell. Now, she was the eldest daughter of Oliver Cromwell, who, of course, was the senior commander in the Parliamentarian Army. And if you know anything about Irish history, you will also know that he is probably the most hated person in Irish history, and that's because of the true savagery of what happened under his leadership during the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, when he was leading the fight against the Royalist Alliance and the Catholic rebels after the execution of Charles I. So, given that reputation as a rather brutal Puritan, this perhaps is not what you would expect him to give as a wedding present. This very beautiful ebony and silver cabinet, you can't see unless you're right beside it. It's decorated with very erotic scenes from the poetry of the Roman poet Ovid. And this is in fact what Cromwell apparently gave to Bridget Cromwell as a wedding gift when she married Charles Fleetwood, and they took up residence in Dublin for 3 years from 1652. If you go to the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin today, you can still see it on display, and it is still known as the Fleetwood Cabinet. But the Irish connections actually go deeper still via Bridget Cromwell, because both she and Charles Fleetwood had been married and widowed before they met and got married. And Bridget Cromwell's first husband was the man on the right, Henry Ireton. So he was Oliver Cromwell's second in command during the Cromwellian campaign of 1649. And then he became the first Lord Deputy of Ireland before meeting an untimely death from plague or fever outside, or rather inside, my hometown of Limerick City. And in Irish history, because of the many things that made Oliver Cromwell absolutely notorious, one of the things that's frequently quoted is this notorious statement, a declaration that he made, that he would send the native Irish to hell or to Connacht. Now, when you look at this map, the province on the western coast in blue, so that is the province of Connacht. So he's always blamed for that. Now, in actual fact, the person who drew up the main legal framework for this mass appropriation of the Catholic-held lands was, in fact, Henry Ireton. And then the person who was responsible for implementing the very punitive terms of the Act of Settlement of 1652, which resulted in not complete, but very large-scale mass confiscation of Catholic-held land and its reallocation to Protestant ex-soldiers and colonists, was, of course, Charles Fleetwood. And you will hear this topic of confiscation of Catholic-held land and its reallocation to English settlers will keep coming back throughout this talk. So we're now going to jump forward about 50 years, and we'll see this theme of anti-Catholic legislation, but other forms of religious discrimination continues. What you can see on the screen is a pamphlet, what you actually see on the screen is a fantastic original volume of Daniel Defoe's pamphlets. It's in Hackney Archives. If you've never been, you really should. It's a fantastic place to go. And that volume contains a pamphlet entitled Persecution of Protestants, the Shortest Way to Prevent the Growth of Popery in Ireland. So popery was a very pejorative term for Roman Catholicism. Now, Defoe never actually went to Ireland, and in his writings he could be pretty hostile to the majority Catholic Irish, but he was born into a frequently repressive state, haunted by bitter religious divisions, and dissenting Protestants were also the subject of discrimination because they opposed the established Anglican Church of England. So when Queen Anne, who was devoutly Anglican, came to the throne in 1702, dissenters were in the spotlight again. And that is why in 1702, Defoe actually wrote this pamphlet called The Shortest Way with Dissenters, in that he was satirizing Anglican polemics against nonconformity, and that landed him in jail for seditious libel for a while. At the same time, not surprisingly, the anti-Catholic penal code became even more severe and repressive than it already had been under the reign of Queen Anne. And in 1704, the Irish Parliament, which still existed at the time, was dominated by this Anglo-Irish Protestant elite. They passed an act to prevent the further growth of popery in Ireland. But this came with a clause surprisingly added by the English Privy Council, which meant that dissenting Protestants in Ireland were to be treated just like Catholics by being disbarred from public office. So Daniel Defoe picks up his pen again. He writes another deeply satirical response, this time on the theme of why persecution of Protestants is, of course, the shortest way to prevent the growth of Catholicism in Ireland. And all of which gives you a sense of how deeply unpleasant it must have been at the time, both to be a member of a minority religion in England and the majority religion in Ireland. So we're going to move on to a slightly more cheerful topic. We have jumped forward about 80 years, and we're going to look at the influence of Ireland on another of Stoke Newington's intellectual dissenters, the pioneering champion of women's rights that was Mary Wollstonecraft. So this is probably very familiar to most of you. This plaque appears on the wall of Newington Green Primary School, and it marks the period when Mary Wollstonecraft, two of her sisters and a friend were running a girls' school close by the site between 1784 and 1786. But the school was not a financial success. So in 1786, she had to close the school and take up a position as a governess in Ireland. And it's believed that this is where this portrait was painted. I think it's not normally the one that we see of Mary Wollstonecraft. I think the popular one makes her appear rather more glamorous. At this stage, she had already submitted her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, for publication, but she just needed a salary, she had debts to clear, and she needed some financial security to be able to set herself up as a professional writer. Now, what came as a great surprise to me was her mother was Irish. Her name was Elizabeth Dixon, and she was from Ballyshannon in County Donegal, which is on the northwest coast of Ireland. Her family were a Protestant family, and they were in the wine merchant business. But it was via a Newington Green neighbour named Sarah Berg, who was friends with the master at Eton College, that Mary Wollstonecraft learned that Lord and Lady Kingsborough of Mitchelstown Castle in County Cork, which you can see here from depicted maybe about 20 years after she was there. They needed a governess for their three daughters. And so in October 1786, the 27-year-old Mary left Stoke Newington for this wonderful castle, where she was to take up her position as governess and receive an annual salary of 40 guineas. The Kingsboroughs were one of the wealthiest Anglo-Irish families of what is known as the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, but their daughters did not make a very good first impression. Mary Wollstonecraft described them as wild Irish and unformed. And during her time with the Kingsboroughs at their castle in Cork and their Dublin residences, one of which was on Henrietta Street in Dublin, which is still there today, it is said that she gained intimate insights into the privileged yet restricted lives of aristocratic women. And it's been argued that her experiences in Ireland at this time were major influences on the radical analyses of gender and class that appear in, of course, her pioneering publication of A Vindication of the Rights of Women. But it does seem that the Irish influence persisted through the generations, because Irish settings also appear in the horror classic Frankenstein, written by her daughter Mary Shelley. There's a wonderful chapter where Dr. Victor Frankenstein, he's a bit lost at sea. He finds himself blown ashore on a wild and rocky place with only traces of civilization. And it is thought that that refers to Donegal. Any Donegal people in the room, my apologies, it's not aimed at you. So we are staying for a while at the end of the 18th century. Amir actually already touched on this. We have the very familiar site of Clissold House, originally known as Paradise House, when it was built by Jonathan Hoare. He was one of the sons of Samuel Hoare, who was a Quaker, a City of London merchant, but had been born in Ireland and then moved over to Stoke Newington. This shows it in 1804, by which time Jonathan Hoare had fallen into financial difficulties and had to give the house up. I haven't been able to find any images of him, but this is an image of his older brother Samuel Hoare, his wife and their daughter Sarah, possibly where they lived in Paradise Row. The extended Hoare family lived there for quite some time. And Samuel Hoare appears frequently in Stoke Newington's dissenting history because, as well as being a Quaker, a philanthropist, a very influential City of London banker, he was, of course, also one of the first founders of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in 1787. And through this incredibly detailed and, quite frankly, very confusing genealogy of the Hoare family that was published in about the 1880s, we can trace their Irish antecedents. So this is kind of a busy slide. I'm just going to pick out a couple of things. So at the bottom, we see the brothers, Jonathan Hoare and Samuel Hoare. And then if we jump up to their great-grandfather, Edward Hoare, we see he was the mayor of Cork in 1686. Now, sometimes you see it reported that Samuel Hoare, the Hoare family came from Dublin, but they were very emphatically from Cork City. And if we jump up another generation to their great-great-grandfather, also Edward Hoare, well, he was originally from Edmonton in Middlesex, and here's that recurring theme. He came over to Ireland as major in the Parliamentarian Army at the same time as Oliver Cromwell and Henry Ireton. And he and his brother were then granted vast tracts of land at Dunmanway in County Cork under the terms of the land appropriation I've mentioned already. And then, in fact, Edward Hoare acquired even more land when there was more confiscations after the Protestant William of Orange beat the Catholic James I at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland in 1619. So it is kind of interesting to reflect on the fact that the origins of the Quaker Hoare family's wealth originated in this mass land appropriation, and then they went on to be successful merchants and bankers in Cork and Stoke Newington and London. So we now leap forward another 100 years, and this is the last of our little 5 vignettes of Irish influence. So I'm sure you'll all recognise this, the very imposing Celtic cross, very close to the Church Street entrance to that temple of nonconformity that is Abney Park Cemetery. Now, it is generally referred to as the Reed Cross because it memorialises 2 of the sons of Sir Charles Reed, who was Hackney's first MP, and his wife, Margaret Baines. And the sons were Andrew Holmes Reed, who died in 1892, and his brother Talbot Baines Reed, who died just over a year later in November 1893. This newspaper clipping from the Dublin Evening Telegraph tells us that the much-admired 17-foot-high Celtic cross was erected in Abney Park in December 1893 by its maker, the sculptor Mr. Edward O'Shea from Kilkenny in Ireland. And it also mentions that O'Shea took inspiration from the ancient Irish crosses of an old monastic site called Kilclipseen. And here it is today. It's near the Kilkenny-Tipperary border. The originals are still intact, maybe a little bit weather-beaten, but considering they're about 1,200 years old, they're still in pretty good shape. And when you look at that exquisite detail of the Reed Cross today, particularly after the fantastic restoration of it by Abney Park recently, we have to remember we're not just looking at a near replica reproduction of the ancient high crosses of Ireland. This is also an expression of the Celtic revival movement of the late 19th century. And this influenced art, design, politics, but also fashions in funerary monuments. And this was across Ireland and Britain. So here is the question that I was confronted with when I was doing this research was there a particular reason beyond fashions in grave memorials as to why the nonconformist Reid family chose that style of grave marker? Well, we do know that the style of the Celtic cross was popular with nonconformist Protestants. This is, I've chosen this quite randomly. It's an example from the same period. It's in Belfast Cemetery, and it marks the grave of a leading Presbyterian minister. So if we go back to look at the Reid family, but if I can get the slides moving, there we go. So we go back and look again at the Reid family, but you'll see in red I've now added the names of the women who married Andrew and Talbot Reid. And you will see that both of those women came from the area around Derry, Londonderry, in the north of Ireland. And the reason this happened was that Charles Reid's sons regularly accompanied him on trips to the north of Ireland, because Charles Reid had many interests beyond being an MP, and one of them included the Honourable the Irish Society. And this building here, you can still see it in the Guildhall Yard in the City of London, with its lovely green door. It's called Irish Chamber, and historically it was the headquarters of the Honourable the Irish Society. And that came into existence in 1609. It was a consortium of City of London livery companies formed somewhat reluctantly under the direction of James I. He wanted the city to finance the plantation of Ulster, which I mentioned at the beginning. It's also why the word London was appended to the place name Derry to make it Londonderry, or indeed Derry, as some of us do still call it today. And because the Irish Society managed their affairs over there from London, Charles Reid, as a representative, regularly travelled back and forth, bringing his family with him. And as the Deputy Governor, he wrote this official history for them. And I love the fact that he included a whole section on the best transport routes to get there, and sites that the visitor should make sure that they went out to see. So love for the Reid family's love for the northern counties of Ireland led to the boys falling in love, and Andrew Holmes Reid married one Jessie Tilley. She was the daughter of one of the most important employers in Derry, Londonderry. William Tilley was the owner of the biggest shirt factory in the world. It was so famous, it employed so many people, it was referenced by Karl Marx when he wrote Das Kapital in 1867. You're welcome. And that is also why there's an incredibly detailed write-up of the wedding in the local papers at the time. But when Andrew died and was buried in Abney Park, it got a very brief mention in those local papers. However, when his widow, Jessie, when she died, she had returned to Derry, Londonderry, after his death, and her death was a major news story because, as you can see here, she was described as a lady of great philanthropy. Now, in contrast, when Talbot Baines Reid died, in the case of Talbot Baines Reid, his marriage to Elizabeth Jane McCurdy Greer, great name, she was the daughter of a man who had briefly been the MP for the county of Londonderry. That didn't get the same sort of coverage in the papers, but when he died in 1893, it was a big story again over in Ulster, like here, because by then he was a very prolific publisher of stories for the boys' own paper, and in fact one of his last stories was set in Ireland. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time. In one of those unexpected twists of historical research, it transpires that Talbot's widow, Elizabeth Jane, had a nephew who went on to work as a parliamentary draftsman for the British government at the beginning of the 20th century. He was Sir Francis Nugent Greer, and he actually worked on the wording of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which led to Irish independence and the partition of Ireland, which of course very neatly brings us back to the topic of the 800 years, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Oops. So, what can we take away from that whistle-stop tour of Stoke Newington's Irish connections? Well, I think the obvious one is that historical narrative dissent, where minority groups are challenging establishment power. That's absolutely true, but it has a very dark shadow side in terms of sectarian discrimination. And that could look very different depending upon whether you were experiencing it in England or Ireland and what religion you practiced. I think it also raised the question of identity. What did it mean in these centuries to be English or British or Irish when the geopolitical boundaries of the state were shifting all the time and religious tolerance and intolerance were waxing and waning? And I love the fact that, for all that Stoke Newington is so often described as a place that's very difficult to get to by public transport. I mean, we can see travelling to Ireland was, if not everyday life, but it did happen, both from, the 17th centuries, the 18th centuries, and then, of course, by the 19th century and the Victorian advances in public transport, Charles Reid is going over and back with his family all the time, and then that 20-ton Celtic cross is transported over from Kilkenny to Abney Park. But finally, we also see that women play a central role in these stories, even where we know very little about them. Even like Mary Hartop. There's no picture of her that I can find, and yet she is the reason that Charles Fleetwood is associated with Stoke Newington. So as a closing thought, I would like to suggest, in the case of the Reid Cross, we should rethink the narrative and stop framing it in relation just to Sir Charles Reid because he was the MP of Hackney. He wasn't even alive when his sons died. And we think about Andrew Holmes Reid's, his wife's very, very strong Northern Irish connections. And we've seen the evidence of what an impact that she had in her own life in Northern Ireland in the beginning of the 20th century. I think we can reasonably surmise that she had a hand in this. So my suggestion would be, when we talk about the Reid Cross, let's talk about Jessie Tilley as well as Charles Reid. And finally, just as a little takeaway, because I know I've run through things at great speed, got a tiny bit over, there's so much more to talk about with all these topics. These are the main sources that I used, with the exception of the British Newspaper Archive. Everything else is in the public domain. So with that, thank you again to Amir for inviting me along this evening, and to all of you for being a wonderful audience.
Very good. Any questions?